Alf Shipman and Sam King opened their first brand new cinema in November 1921 at Hailsham near Eastbourne. The pavilion, designed by Hastings architect Henry Cousins, seated 400 and closed in May 1965. Bingo was played here for many years, but in May 1990 the building was derelict. When it first opened, it had red plush seats that were said to be very comfortable, and ventilation was hygienically carried out, drafts having been obviated. The screen was painted directly onto the rear wall, and there were at first no screen curtains. The next was the Pavilion Hoddesdon. This opened in February 1930 with 838 seats. The pavilion was a conversion of part of a brewery and had been designed by Howes and Belcham. The third purpose-built cinema, the Regent Crowborough, replaced the picture house almost opposite. The Regent opened in November 1931 and was designed by Henry Cousins. A.R. Shipman lived locally, and this was the reason such an ambitious theatre was built at this early stage in the circuit's history in this small, out-of-the-way town. The Regent seated 700, and performances started daily as early as 1:15. The cinemas at Tunbridge Wells, a much larger town only 10 miles away, did not open until an hour later. The Regent at Rye opened in October 1932. This was also designed by Hastings architect Henry Cousins. The Regent replaced the Rye Electric Palace. The Regent seated 700 and was closed abruptly in 1942 when an enemy bomb scored a direct hit. A morning screening of army instructional films had finished. The theatre had been cleared, but unfortunately the assistant manager, who was still on the premises, was killed. The fifth Shipman and King theatre to be built was at Hawley. This opened in April 1935, and exterior resemblances to Crowborough and Rye are very apparent, as this was also designed by H.W. Cousins. The Regent had a cafe, and the auditorium seated 1,000. The Regent continued the style being set for Shipman and King theatres. Luxurious, medium-sized cinemas set in small towns in the home counties, each equipped to a high standard and in many cases complete with organ. Alf Shipman and Sam King set up in business at the end of World War I. They had been respectively violinist and pianist in cinemas, and they saw possibilities in becoming exhibitors. Shipman and King Cinemas Limited were registered in 1920. A.R. Shipman and S.S. King's circuit eventually grew to about 40 theatres. They chose their sites in the middle-class country towns of the home counties with remarkable care. Shipman and King opened the Embassy Braintree. This was the first of many subsequent Shipman and King theatres to have the name Embassy. Leslie Kemp and Tasker managed to design a 1,005-seater on a restricted site that had been previously occupied by the Shipman and King-controlled Palace. Of the partnership, Sam King managed the day-to-day affairs of the circuit, and A.R. Shipman was the financial director. He had a brother, Mick Shipman, who joined the company on its formation in 1920, and for many years was booking manager. Circuit supervisor was A.E. Randall. By 1926, the circuit consisted of the Montpellier Picture and Variety Theatre, Walworth, the Super Cinema Walthamstow, the Hoddesdon Cinema, the Electric Palace Rye, the Picture House Crowborough, the Picture Theatre Tenterden, the new Pavilion Hawley, the Pavilion Hailsham, and the Hippodrome Malden. Only the Pavilion Hailsham was an S&K built cinema at this time, but in nearly every situation where they were represented, Shipman and King would eventually build a brand new theatre. All the purpose-built ones were luxurious and mostly of about 1,000 seats, because this was the size Shipman and King considered economic. Occasionally they built larger theatres, but from 1935 onwards, never smaller. At Reigate, Shipman and King went into partnership with H. Bancroft and took over the Hippodrome. This was modernised and re-equipped, and the refurbished auditorium seated 850. Buildings to the right of the Hippodrome were demolished to make way for a new access road to a brand new cinema, the Majestic. The Majestic opened in November 1935. It was to be the largest theatre ever operated by the circuit, with close on 2,000 seats. The Majestic was designed by Wisbech architects Ward and Woolnough, who had designed other cinemas for H. Bancroft, notably the Empire Wisbech. Bancroft had cinema interests in March, Ely, Holbeach and Peterborough, but only at Reigate was he associated with Shipman and King. The projection room had two Cayley 11 projectors and a Western Electric 2 AM wide-range sound system when it opened. In July 1973, when these photographs were taken, this original equipment was still going strong. A.R. Shipman and S.S. King never set up in opposition to another cinema. Before building a new cinema, they would acquire any existing cinema in a town. The Shipman and King circuit specialised in having pairs of cinemas in country towns, usually an older one and a new one specially built. Reigate is a typical example. The organ was a 6-rank Christie, as supplied to other S&K theatres, and this was a particularly fine one. The Embassy Malden was opened in March 1936 by Shipman and King, where they were already represented by the Hippodrome. The Embassy had 1,250 seats, a cafe and a Wurlitzer organ. This was unusual, as the circuit normally bought cheaper Christie models. The Embassy Petts Wood, close to Orpington in Kent, opened in October 1936. It was a typically luxurious Shipman and King property, designed by David Evelyn Nye, and seated 1,350. The Embassy closed in April 1973, was demolished, The Rex Northwood Hills was built and equipped as an Odeon, but for some reason it was sold to Shipman and King and opened by them in December 1936. Designed by Andrew Mather, the Rex seated 1,000. Shipman and King operated it until it closed and was demolished in September 1973. At Chesham, Shipman and King ran the Palace, which they renamed the Astoria, and continued to operate this cinema in the town after they opened their embassy. This pleasant property opened in January 1937 and was designed by David E. Nye. In common with most Shipman and King properties, it had a cafe. The auditorium seated 1,300 and provision was made for an organ, but this was never installed. At Tenterden, the Cinema Palace opened in 1912. This held 350 and continued in business until the embassy opened. The Cinema Palace was then converted into a series of lock-up shops. The Tenterden Embassy is another example of the tasteful cinemas built by Shipman and King, whose heartlands were the country towns of southeast England. Hastings architect Henry W. Cousins designed the cinema, and a homely, rather than elegant, first-floor cafe completed the amenities. This small 700-seater super cinema closed in 1969 and was converted into a supermarket. The Embassy name on the frontage has been retained. When the Embassy Esher in Surrey opened in August 1937, it was the 31st cinema in the Shipman and King circuit. Adjoining the balcony foyer was the cafe. One of the features of the auditorium, which had seating for 1,500, is the double rake of the floor. From the back, the floor slopes gently down to a point halfway along the auditorium and then rises to a slightly steeper angle towards the proscenium end. By the use of this method, the architect, David Nye, was able to save considerable time and expense in excavations because the land behind the cinema rises. Although not built or opened by Shipman and King, the studio Bletchley was taken over in September 1937. Designed by E.B. Parkinson for the Fletcher Barnett Syndicate, the studio seated 890. Another cinema designed by E.B. Parkinson for the same syndicate that Shipman and King took over at that time was the studio Elstree. A virtually identical Fletcher Barnett Parkinson cinema, the studio in Hassocks, Sussex, seating 850, somehow escaped ever becoming an S&K property. And yet Hassocks was exactly the kind of town where Shipman and King liked to be represented. The Palace Waltham Cross was a 1931 acquisition by Shipman and King. They renovated and enlarged the cinema and reopened it as a Regent. In the mid-30s, S&K were anxious to further enlarge the Regent, but were thwarted in attempts to buy enough land, so they built the Embassy nearly opposite. The Embassy opened in November 1937 and was designed by local architects Howis and Belcham. There was a cafe over the entrance. The Embassy seated 1,700, and its Christie organ was the one that S&K had installed in the court Berkhamsted in 1934. The Embassy Dorking opened as a Gaumont in February 1938, and 15 weeks later, on the 17th of June 1938, had its name changed to Embassy and was from then on controlled by Shipman and King. The architect was Harry Weston, who built other cinemas that would be operated by Gaumont British at Chadwell Heath, Rochester, Carshalton and Chichester. Dorking was the only theatre of his to be controlled by Shipman and King. At Fareham, the 1933 Savoy was at one end of the main shopping thoroughfare, the Embassy at the other. The Embassy opened in May 1938. Both cinemas were operated by Shipman and King. The Embassy, like the Savoy, seated 1,000. In the auditorium, the splay walls had a fibre grill effect, which was a well-known characteristic in many of Shipman and King's theatres. The Fareham Embassy was designed by David Nye. Not all Shipman and King cinemas were new properties. At Berkhamsted they took over the 1917-built court in March 1930, then in 1934 modernised and enlarged the cinema from 624 seats to nearly 1,000. A Christie 3-manual 6-rank organ was installed at this time, only to be resited at Waltham Cross 3 years later. The Rex Berkhamsted opened in May 1938, and the architect was David Nye. There proved to be insufficient room for a cafe in the Circle Lounge, and so the rear stalls area was reduced to provide the necessary space. A very unusual result was that the Circle had more seats than the stalls. Total seating was 1,100. More than a year was to elapse before the next and final pre-war Shipman and King cinema was to open. This was at Crawley and opened in August 1938. The Embassy was another venture shared with H. Bancroft of Reigate, and the architect for Crawley was Robert Cromie. This cinema seated 1,014, which is a very large number for the small township that Crawley was in 1938. Shipman and King's advisors must have been blessed with prophetic vision when they decided on this country location, for Crawley is now a very important town close to Gatwick Airport. The Riverlea Ruislip opened in September 1929 with 757 seats. It was taken over by Shipman and King together with the Astoria. This seated 800, was renamed Embassy in April 1967, had a new facade, but was closed in November 1981 and demolished. The Astoria Ashford opened in October 1939. It was a very modern-looking property, in many ways similar to a purpose-built Odeon. The Astoria was owned by Perrin and Perrin, but Shipman and King took it over in 1948. The Astoria closed in 1975 and was converted to bingo. As a cinema, it used to seat 1,140. In 1965, Sam King let it be known that the Shipman and King circuit was up for sale, and in 1967 it was taken over by the Grade brothers, Bernard Delfont and Lou Grade. The Astoria at Purley opened as an independent cinema in April 1934. It had a checkered career, being subjected to barring clauses by Croydon and Caterham, and was opposed by an ABC-operated Regal, half a mile down the Brighton Road. The Astoria had been designed by F.C. Mitchell and seated 1,550. It had a cafe and a small Compton organ opened by Robin Richmond. It was taken over by Shipman and King in February 1949. 20 years later, in 1969, EMI, the old His Master's Voice record company, through the ambition of the Grade brothers, Bernard Delfont and Lou Grade, who were now on the EMI board, took over the Associated British Picture Corporation. Associated British Cinemas and Shipman and King were now effectively one company. In 1954, Shipman and King acquired the Regent Chelmsford from Eastern Counties Cinemas Limited. The Regent had opened as a live theatre in 1913, but went over to pictures in 1916. Seating capacity of the Regent was 1,000. Indian-looking Palace Portsmouth was taken over together with several other Portsmouth Town Cinemas properties in the mid-60s. Built in 1921 by local architect A.E. Gogswell, the interior is completely devoid of any atmospheric decoration. The palace seated 626. The Ritz at Gosport also came from Portsmouth Town Cinemas. Bombed during the war, the Ritz had opened in 1935. This replacement cinema, which was very similar to the original, opened in October 1958. It seated 1,400. One of the last takeovers by Shipman and King was the futurist Birmingham from the Seoul Levy circuit. This happened in 1967. But by this time, Shipman and King were part of the Grade organisation. In 1967, Just as the Futurist was being taken over, the grade organisation itself, including the Shipman and King circuit, were acquired by EMI. Construction of this cinema had started in 1914, but owing to the war was not completed until 1919. Originally to be called the Majestic, when someone proposed a toast at the topping out ceremony to the future, so Levy said, "That's it, the Futurist," the new name for this cinema. In 1955, the Futurist became a showcase theatre for 20th Century Fox, when they were in dispute with the Rank organisation over stereophonic sound. The Futurist had originally seated 1,220. The last purpose-built Shipman and King theatre of all was the new Regent at Rye. The old Regent had been destroyed by bombing in 1942, and this replacement theatre was opened in March 1948.